where we are now, when ritual fails. In his study of a Javanese funeral ceremony, Gertz ventured to analyze a ritual which failed to function properly. In quotes. The analysis is simple and compelling. He begins by discussing the inability of functionalism to deal with social change and transformational social processes. The reason for this, he suggests, is the tendency of functional theory to identify social conflict as disintegration and to treat sociological and cultural processes unequally, reducing either one to the other. Such reductionism makes it impossible to articulate social change, which arises in the, quote, failure of cultural patterns to be perfectly congruent with the forms of social organizations. Thus, to develop theoretical tools capable of analyzing social change, Gertz wishes to distinguish clearly between culture and the social system. He defines culture as, quote, an ordered system of meaning and of symbols in terms of which social interaction takes place. The social system, on the other hand, is, quote, the pattern of social interaction itself. The conceptual dispositional nature of this distinction is made apparent when he further describes them as a framework of beliefs, in contrast to ongoing processes of interactive behavior. Culture is the set of meaningful terms people use for interpretation and guidance. Social system is the actual form that action takes. With these categories and a great deal of contextual detail, Gertz's analysis analyzes the particular failure of funeral service held after the sudden death of a young boy. He considers the funeral rites to have failed for the following reasons. First, they heightened tension and distress in the community rather than producing the usual effects of ikhlas, a detached acceptance of death, and rukun, communal harmony. Thus, the usual Islamic procedures were not followed due to a local officiant's sense of conflict between these practices and the politics of a new group to which the household of the boy belonged. The third, the modifications desperately introduced in order to proceed with the funeral of some sort were ad hoc, unauthorized, and initiated by individual enterprise rather than by consensus. Gertz concludes that the conflict which surfaced at the funeral was the result of a growing discontinuity between the community's cultural framework of beliefs and the actual patterns of social interaction. That is, community members were urbanites who still thought like villagers, expecting village values to fit increasingly urban forms of organization behind which quite different values were actually operative. Gertz argues that a conflict between the community's cultural categories, belief and values, and their customary social behavior, group affiliation, emerged in the funeral. This example illustrates the expedient homogenizing and collapsing of levels of analysis that can make an interpretation appear so effective. Gertz's initial discussion contrasts the functionalism of sociological and social psychological approaches with an approach that can articulate the dynamics of change in positive terms. Within the space of just a few paragraphs, however, these contrasting and analytical perspectives have been rendered loosely equivalent to a distinction between sociological and cultural process, which Gertz argues should be considered independently and treated equally. These processes are then described as the forces that are mobilized and brought to confrontation in ritual. Since ritual that does not work is identified as one in which cultural and sociological categories are experienced as discontinuous, we are led to assume that successful rituals are those in which these terms or forces are perfectly congruent. Gertz has done two things in this analysis. First, the two methodological perspectives, the sociological and cultural, have been homogenized with a pair of analytical categories, culture and social system, as defined by Gertz, which were then found to be those very sundered forces underlying the dynamics of the unsuccessful ritual. This is a collapse of three levels and an implicit identification of three sets of oppositions. Ultimately, the discontinued affirmation in the conclusion is a direct replication of the differentiation established in the beginning. Second, there are some implications for ritual. Gertz's usual model of ritual is upheld in this analysis by the implication that a successful ritual is one in which the differentiated forces of culture and social systems can be effectively integrated. In addition, however, if an unsuccessful ritual affects change, then a successful one maintains status or no change. Thus, in Gertz's analysis, ritual as an integrative mechanism is also a synchronic force within the society, rendering it roughly equivalent to that he considers culture. Although it is fairly clear that Gertz wants to conclude that ritual facilitates change, he is logically kept from such a conclusion by the description of this rite as a failure, by the pure oppositions that such an unsuccessful ritual leaves unresolved. The myth of the fundamental contradiction. There are several other ways in which ritual has been cast as a mechanism for the resolution of basic oppositions or contradictions. The most common approach, I've argued, is exemplified in the work of Gertz. A slightly different form can be seen in the work of Max Gluckham and some of V. Turner's analysis. In this approach, ritual is the arena in which purely social conflicts are worked out. In general, they describe how social conflict is recognized within the strategic limits of ritual, where it can be systematically subsumed within a reaffirmation of unity. Hear that? You wonder why people are dancing so much, but not really dancing. Gregory Bateson and Levi Strauss both employ yet another permutation of the approach. For them, the conflict is not as general as that between ethos and worldview, nor is it as simple as the concrete as a social conflict between two parties. The problem is identified as one embedded in the social structure, while the ritual solution is more or less symbolic one that does not affect any real changes. For Bateson, an outstanding feature of the Edamul Navin ceremony was the cross-dressing of particular relatives and the specific sexual gesture of their mother's brother. Analyzing these acts and features let Bateson conclude that the ritual strengthens the tense and ambiguous relationship between a child and his or her mother's family. For his part, Levi Strauss saw in the asymmetrical facial paintings of the Kuduvo Indians the attempt to resolve a lived contradiction, namely the dilemma of marriage in a rigidly hierarchical society lacking any institutional structure for unrestricted and egalitarian exchange. He suggested that the facial paintings were the symbolic expression of an attempt at a compromise, since the Kuduvo were never really able to articulate and resolve effectively the contradiction in which they were caught. Levi Strauss argued that ritual ultimately seeks the resolution of the inherent conflict of culture and nature. As with Gertz's approach, these theories see ritual as designed to address fundamental conflicts and contradictions in the society, and there is similarly little evidence that the conflicts so addressed are not simply imposed through the categories of the observer. As we have seen, it is quite common for scholars to see ritual as resolving the conflict between thought and action, particularly in the guise of belief systems in conflict with the real world. Contradiction is, of course, a standard Hegelian and Marxist term that figures prominently in analysis of social process. For Marx, contradiction occurs when the forces of material production begin to outstrip the system of social relations to which earlier they gave rise. Other Marxist analysis suggests that the perception of such contradictions can be repressed by the generation of ideological structures. Thus, cultural artifacts such as Kudovo face paintings or works of literature are seen as expressions of this repressed but lived contradiction, expressions that embody the contradiction while attempting to resolve the version of it. For Marxists and many cultural anthropologists, therefore, a basic contradiction at the root of social experience provides the impulse for the generation of a variety of integral social phenomenon, historical change and revolution, or cultural itself with its arts and institutions. Whether the emphasis is on how such fundamental contradictions are repressed or expressed, displaced, or resolved, they are usually linked to fissures of a type that provide the theorists with an interpretive entree into the ideological structures of a society, an activity, or a cultural artifact. Levi Strauss and Bordeaux talk of fundamental oppositions that generate various oppositional series, which can all be reduced in turn to the most fundamental opposition. In some passages, these fundamental oppositions do not seem to mean much in themselves, but are effective for the internal organization of taxonic schemes that generate the sense of coherent cultural unity. That is, such oppositions are not basic or fundamental in the sense of being underlying or absolute social, metaphysical, or logical values. Rather, They are particularly useful tools for invoking and manipulating the taxonomic schemes of a culture. Bordeaux also describes ritual's role in affecting change in terms of how it breaks up the natural taxonomic order as to impose the reordering of culture. Ritual, he states, always aims to facilitate and authorize passages or encounters with opposed orders, presumably the orders of nature and culture, or equally reified, the old order and the new order. In this general type of argument, or the notion of a fundamental social contradiction appears highly suspicious, or at least by virtue of the way in which the imposition of a neat, logical structure renders ritual action amenable to theoretical analysis. Certainly the identification of a contradiction out there, at the root of a culture and society, also works to construct an object and method of analysis by which theory can be seen to grasp and explain the puzzles that the others simply live. Roy Wagner states that, quote, anthropology is theorized and taught so as to rationalize contradiction, paradox, and dialectic, end quote. Indeed, contradiction in some form is readily presumed in order to mandate the rational exercises, resolutions, and breakthroughs of theory. The notion that ritual resolves a fundamental social contradiction can be seen as a type of myth, legitimizing the whole apparatus of ritual studies. Equally mythical, perhaps, is the notion that there is anything fundamental. As a counterpart in logic to the search of origins in historical studies, the notion of fundamental force or conflict also functions suspiciously like some key to understanding. In an exasperated tone, Foucault has declared that, quote, nothing is fundamental. And that, he continues, is what is really interesting about social phenomenon. Quote, there are only reciprocal relations and the perpetual gaps between intentions in relation to one another, end quote. In the interests of identifying such seductive myths and exploring truly alternative conceptions of ritual activity, it is probably more useful to proceed with the notion that ritual is not some basic mechanism for resolving or disguising conflicts fundamental to socio-cultural life. So you see, if Václav Havel was correct, and I believe he was, that what we're dealing with is a dictatorship of the ritual more than anything else. That it is those who are capable of invoking the empty phrase without meaning, that in thereby doing that, and that it's those people who ascend into power within the praxis, that it is those who this system ruled by anonymous flunkies and soulless automatons will only allow the invocation of the empty phrase, because here's the thing, the entire system of totalitarian creep and everything that's underneath it is based on lies. It looks past and over reality in order to dictate pseudo-reality, a socrealism, soc meaning relationship, and that everything that exists and anything that happens either is something which furthers the ideal or inhibits it. It has nothing to do with reality. And that's completely, well, I'll say this. One only has to know a little bit about how we, for example, as Jews, bury our dead, and how much it is rooted in reality and in life, to understand that these fundamental descriptions of ritual are so flawed and so rooted in another theology. And there's no, it makes perfect sense. why it has to be over and over again this manufactured deviance and a manufacture of conflict. All you have to do is go look at the first video and see how many people were calling me names as if it was going to change anything. Because why? What is it that I'm fundamentally doing or suggesting that creates that kind of reaction by anonymous flunkies and soulless automatons? So with that, I'm going to close this off, and I encourage you to listen to the whole thing. Again, it's from this Readings and Ritual Studies. I was blessed to be able to get my degree in the arts and had a great deal of studying in social sciences, including rituals, because my focus was on experimental and classical theater. See, culture is the stream. And if you look and see how many fundamental rituals were removed starting in 2020, and how many new ones imposed, just look at how ritualized so much of politics is. One only has to look at all the rituals we see coming even out of the conflict. Why is there so much ritualization around Hamas? Why? I've said it before, this is... The socrealism is responsible for the deaths of millions of men and women. It is. It is not an aesthetic, it's a philosophy. And in that philosophy, the hero is toil, and the toiler is unthinkable outside the collective. It's like Borg. It's a mechanized religion. You could even say a machine yearning for the soul. And they defined it as a way to engineer human souls. And most people, whether it was Meyerhold or Pasternak or many others, were purged or made to be fearful to even talk about this. But I'll say there's one really great moment in the movie Clueless from the 90s where you see a little conversation that goes back and forth that begins with, well, I think there is merit in learning forms outright. Go back and watch it. It's really funny. And humor and satire is some of the best way to combat such bullshit. Because it's bullshit. To quote Eugenie Ionescu too, recognize that which is horrifying, and to laugh at it is to become master of that which is horrifying. I hope this helps. I know it's a lot.